Welcome to Progressivism After Roosevelt, Taft and Wilson, Part 2, an online U.S. history tutorial for students in 11th grade. Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated in 1913. He was a serious man with a strong will and a moralistic view of politics, not totally unlike Theodore Roosevelt's. For the new president, politics consisted of good and bad, right and wrong. Wilson soon began to carry out his own version of progressivism. His first priority as president was to reduce the nation's high tariff, something that Taft had tried and failed to accomplish. Wilson went before Congress in person, the first time a president had done so since John Adams, to call for tariff reform. When some senators in his own party tried to undermine him, Wilson called them out as insidious or treacherous and drummed up public support for his plan. It was the kind of bold action that reminded Americans of Roosevelt. Under Wilson's strong leadership, the Underwood tariff that Congress passed brought rates down to their lowest percent since the 1850s, helping consumers and small businesses at the expense of big business. Wilson was also determined in his own way to be a trust buster in the model of both Roosevelt and Taft. He signed into law the Clayton Antitrust Act, an expansion of 1890's Sherman Antitrust Act that gave the government power to battle monopolies. The Clayton Act prohibited certain practices that might lead to the formation of trusts. For example, an individual would no longer be allowed to sit on the board of directors of two different companies which, if they combined, would form a trust. President Wilson hoped that the Clayton Act would guide businesses toward proper behavior so that regulating them would be unnecessary. To enforce the Clayton Act and further keep a watchful eye on trusts, Wilson signed the law that created the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC. This independent agency, still in existence more than a century later, has two main functions. One is to investigate and prosecute anti-competitive business practices, basically trusts and monopolies. The other is to protect consumers against unfair or deceptive practices by businesses, like false advertising or fraud. In the area of conservation, President Wilson continued the preservation of public lands begun by his predecessors. Places as diverse as Hawaii volcanoes, Acadia, and Zion all became national parks during Wilson's presidency. And in 1916, Wilson created the National Park Service, an independent government agency with a mission to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and wildlife, as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. Probably the most important piece of domestic legislation signed by Woodrow Wilson was the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. This act created the Federal Reserve System, a central banking system for the United States. A bit of history is in order. The country had lacked a national bank in which the U.S. government was the largest shareholder for almost 80 years. President Andrew Jackson had made good on his promise to kill the Second Bank of the United States, whose charter he allowed to expire in 1836. After this, there were regular periods of economic depression, called panics at the time, that the government could do little to prevent or control. With a central bank, the United States could borrow money from itself, loan money to struggling banks across the country, or adjust the amount of currency in circulation. But without such a bank, the government lacked these tools. Twice during the Panic of 1893 and the Panic of 1907, a wealthy private citizen, J.P. Morgan, needed to step in to rescue the economy with his own personal fortune. Progressives like President Wilson thought this was a foolish and backward way for a wealthy nation like the United States to operate. The Federal Reserve System was their solution. The Federal Reserve, sometimes called the Fed for short, divides the nation into 12 districts. Each has its own Federal Reserve Bank. You can see the districts on this map. The 12 reserve banks are located in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Richmond, Atlanta, Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Kansas City, Dallas, and San Francisco. National banks located in these regions are required to hold stock in their region's reserve bank by giving it money. This connects them to the federal money supply and gives banks across the entire nation the backing of the United States. Who runs the Federal Reserve? A 7-member board of governors oversees the 12 reserve banks and sets monetary policy for the entire country. This means the Fed can control the cost of credit by adjusting interest rates and making it cheaper or more expensive to borrow money. These measures let the Fed nudge the economy in a particular direction, to encourage consumer spending, for example, or to try to prevent inflation. Members of the Board of Governors, intended to be economic experts, are appointed by the president. But the Fed is designed to operate in a manner that might be called independently within the government. The governors follow the orders of no president. They even operate separately from the Treasury Department, which prints the currency the Fed uses. The Federal Reserve has always been the target of criticism and even conspiracy theories. Especially in its first several decades, when it played a less active role, it was unable to prevent the regular boom and bust cycle of the economy. Regardless, Woodrow Wilson's establishment of the Federal Reserve was one of the most significant acts of his presidency and an important moment in American economic history. With his successful reforms of the tariff and the banking system, combined with new antitrust measures, Woodrow Wilson seemed to some Americans like the most successful progressive president yet. Some credit Wilson with presiding over the high tide of progressivism, the moment when the movement reached its highest level of success. But the legacy of Wilson as a progressive is more complicated. In 1914, the president told the American people that the progressive movement had largely fulfilled its mission. He even said that the nation needed a time of healing. Other progressives were alarmed and disappointed. Wilson had done little to help the causes of labor unions or women's suffrage. Child labor was still legal. In the 1914 congressional elections, Wilson's Democratic Party lost seats to the Republicans. The loss was enough to make Wilson concerned about the next presidential election. Would he be popular enough to win a second term when his first victory had been something of a fluke? Wilson decided to appeal to Bull Moose Republicans, those who had supported Theodore Roosevelt 2 years earlier. He was determined to reinvigorate his presidency by re-embracing progressive causes. For example, he signed into law a Federal Employees' Compensation Act that allowed government employees to receive wages if they were injured on the job. It was an early form of what would become disability insurance. Wilson also signed into law the Keaton-Owing Child Labor Act. This outlawed the interstate sale of goods if they were produced in factories that hired children younger than 14 or in mines that hired children younger than 16. The law was a huge victory for progressive activists, but less than a year after going into effect, it was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The court said that Congress had no right to regulate manufacturing within states. Wilson had more success with the Adamson Act, which Congress passed in response to the threat of a nationwide railroad strike. The law established an 8-hour workday for interstate railroad workers, with extra pay for overtime work. The 40-hour workweek, along with overtime pay, would eventually become standard practices in the American workplace. By embracing various reform movements, Wilson successfully appealed to enough progressives to win re-election in 1916. On one important issue, President Wilson was somewhat unprogressive until politics forced him to reverse course. The issue was women's suffrage, which Wilson opposed on the national level. The suffrage movement gained steam throughout Wilson's presidency, with many progressives calling for a constitutional amendment. Wilson mostly ignored the movement. He did not want to upset fellow Democrats opposed to votes for women. Beginning in January 1917, Alice Paul's National Woman's Party began a 6-month picket of the White House. They held signs directly targeting the president and urging him to take action. The protests grew unpopular, and in June 1917, picketers were arrested on charges of obstructing traffic. Wilson wanted to avoid bad publicity, and he even pardoned some of those arrested. But several, including the movement's leader, Alice Paul, went to jail and began a hunger strike. The prison force-fed them under brutal conditions, and when this became known to the public, they were all released. The resulting scandal shocked and embarrassed the president, who now, after 5 years in office, switched decisively over to support votes for women. Wilson appeared before Congress to urge the passage of a constitutional amendment giving all women the right to vote. From then on, the president would be a champion of what would become the 19th Amendment, which was ratified and added to the Constitution in 1920. The progressive era is considered to have ended by the year 1920. What happened? As you've seen, Woodrow Wilson was only somewhat committed to progressive issues. He tended to support them most when it helped him politically. Starting in 1917, Wilson's focus and that of the nation would shift dramatically. In April of that year, the United States joined the Allies of World War I by declaring war on Germany. This decision followed several years of American neutrality in the war. From that point on, Wilson would be a wartime president dedicated to an Allied victory. And after the war ended, with the U.S. on the winning side, the president would be chiefly concerned with matters of peace and international relations. Wilson would actually spend the last year and a half of his presidency largely incapacitated due to a stroke he suffered. So from 1917 onward, there was little leadership or energy for progressive causes in the White House. The war changed everything. Progressive issues that had once seemed of national importance now seemed less so. At least for a few years, Americans would be less concerned with improving their own society than in embracing their new role as a world leader. Also, to take the long view, many progressive causes had been achieved, all or in part, by the end of the decade. Women gained the right to vote. Alcohol was made illegal, the long-sought goal of the temperance movement. Progress had been made on issues like child labor and safer working conditions. Politics had been cleaned up somewhat, and the trusts had been busted to an extent. Conservation of natural resources was now permanently part of the national agenda. The United States was no longer in the Gilded Age. In 1920, Warren G. Harding was elected president. He was a Republican, but more like the old-school pro-business presidents of the 19th century than like Theodore Roosevelt. No one referred to Harding or the Republican presidents who followed him as progressives. In fact, Harding was elected on a campaign promising Americans a return to normalcy. The progressive era, in some ways, had been a turbulent time in American life. Much had changed relatively quickly, but the national mood in the 1920s then seemed to embrace continuity rather than continued change. But, like a political tide going in and out, progressivism would re-emerge during several important periods in the 20th century, although not always bearing that label. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s pushed progressive causes and programs to the forefront. So did Lyndon Johnson's Great Society in the 1960s. Eventually, almost all the changes progressives called for, even the ones that seemed radical at the time, became America's reality. Today, we tend to take them for granted.